Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Educated Call Snap channel. How you doing? So today I've got a video for you today. I've got a great video for you today. We're going to be fully breaking down the meta. So we're going to be doing a meta tier list. We're going to be talking about every single archetype, not every single, but all the major archetypes in the meta, breaking them down in tiers. We're going to give you decks that you can build, standard deck lists, spicy deck lists, anything you want. And we're really just going to discuss the meta in a holistic sense and just really give you an understanding of what you want to play, what looks fun to you, and what is viable in today's landscape. Let's begin. So first off, we're going to, this is like a guide, a footnote of how you want to look at this. So we're going to have the name at the top. We're going to have at least two lists. So we're going to have either two standard lists, or we're going to have a standard list and a spicy list, something a little bit interesting. If we do have a spicy one, I'll definitely address it. And then on the right side, we're going to have the notes accompanying this particular archetype, or in some cases, we're going to have a third deck list if I just felt like it was warranted for that particular archetype. So just something to keep in mind. We're going to usually have two deck lists and then notes and then the name at the top. So first things off, we're going in order. So I would say I ordered this list pretty well. So things at the top are usually going to be much better at things at the bottom. But I do want to say that everything is playable, right? I am not really of the belief that you can only play whatever archetype is the best in the game. I don't really subscribe to that at all. I think there's two types of decks, a playable deck and a not playable deck. And I would say every archetype here is in the playable category. So don't feel like you have to pick something at like the highest tiers. If you want to play something looks fun to you, I'm making these decks that look presentable. Now, they're not all going to be like, oh, everything can beat everything. That's ridiculous. But I think if you understand your archetype, you know your win conditions, you'll be able to climb with these decks. And that's the end goal, having a deck that is fun for you that you can climb with. So without further ado, let's get started. Obviously, first thing is Shuri. First archetype is Shuri. This archetype has been dominant in the meta for multiple weeks, maybe multiple months. It's definitely one of the strongest decks overall that you can play. Obviously, it did get a few nerfs overall very recently. They nerfed Red Skull. They've nerfed Sunspot. They don't show up in this the deck overview because the website I'm using hasn't updated yet, but I am aware of the nerfs. And the nerfs are the reason why this isn't tier 0. I would say the nerfs do a little bit. Obviously, Shuri is still going to be very strong, very consistent. But it does bring it down where other archetypes can compete. And that's really important, right? You don't want to neuter the archetype, but you want to make sure that this isn't the only thing that will do well in any format, which is kind of what we've been having for a little bit. So definitely still think it's a very strong deck. It's very powerful. One of its weaknesses is because it's played so much, it's now very predictable. You kind of know what's going to happen when people play their cards, when they play their armor, when they play their Cosmo. You kind of know what's going to happen. And that really can hurt this deck. But because it's just so consistent, it doesn't really fully affect the win conditions and how you want to pilot the deck. So strong deck, very, very common to see, but has that predictable downside. Moving on. Next up, I want to talk about is Thanos Lockjaw. So they did nerf Thanos, right? Quinjet isn't really seen in this archetype anymore, but Thanos with Lockjaw is still plenty powerful, especially with Leech, especially with all the big cards, Devil Sword, that you can really just synergize with this. And it's a very, very strong deck and hasn't really fell too much down, I would say, in terms of how played it is, at least at the highest tiers. Obviously, you don't have that broken Quinjet mechanic, but I still think Thanos is a very flexible card in the game. You can really play it with multiple archetypes, but in particular, this one, Lockjaw is key. If you're really fighting against this type of deck and they don't play the Lockjaw, you really have a good chance of competing with them if you have a good hand. So if they don't hit the Lockjaw, especially turn 3, turn 4, that's really when you want to be pressuring this deck. But when they do hit the Lockjaw and they get to put their stones in there, it's really just obnoxious, especially when they hit Mind Stone early. Mind Stone, another thing I could have put in the notes, where Mind Stone early is also a death nail sometimes, because they get to draw all of their stones early, and the things that Lockjaw can hit is really just their big units. So definitely a very strong archetype, has a lot of flexibility, a lot of game patterns, and something you can be taking a look at trying if you still want to play Thanos. Next up, we have DarkHawk. DarkHawk, a very solid list, has been pretty decent ever since Zabu came out, I would say. DarkHawk has always been in the shadows, just doing well. It's been hard to get. That was maybe its biggest downside, but as it's dropped down in series and more people have access to tokens, especially starting this month, you're really going to see a lot more of DarkHawk, especially with Basque and Hitmonkey coming down. There's a lot of ways to use DarkHawk nowadays, so definitely think it's just a good archetype. The one we have here is really just DarkHawk Dino, where you're using both DarkHawk or Dino as your win conditions. And since you're running Mystique, it lets you very easily synergize between the two of those units. And then alternatively, if you don't want to play with Dino, you can just play standard DarkHawk, where you just go Korg, Black Widow into DarkHawk, Mystique, and the alternative win con there would be the Moon Girl into the She-Hulk. So you can go, if you don't have a good start, you can go Moon Girl, copy She-Hulks, play 2 She-Hulks and a DarkHawk or something like that. So there's the alternative win condition there. But they're both definitely fine decks. DarkHawk is definitely something you will be seeing more of in the future, especially as more people have access to that particular card. Moving on, we have Electro Ramp. So the reason this one is also tier 1 is because this archetype is very, very strong. It's the current meta. Hitmonkey just came out. A lot of people want to try Hitmonkey. Electro Ramp just says, no experimentations here. We're not doing that today. So you just get to shut down what people want to do. You're the fun police, and you're here to ruin everyone's day, but you get to climb with it. So, you know, who is the fun police there? You generally want to ramp into Doom. That's your usual win con. Dr. Doom is definitely a fantastic card, especially when you're shutting them down. It just does so much for you. And alternatively, you can just use your other tools as needed, but you definitely want to be playing ramp into Doom. That's really how you take advantage of these archetypes. I do want to mention now archetypes I have videos for. So I have a video on Electro Ramp. I have a video on Shuri. Don't have one on Thanos. Actually don't have one on DarkHawk, which is surprising, right? Because I've used to play so much DarkHawk, but yeah. So anytime there's a video that a deck breakdown specifically, I should definitely mention it here. Maybe in the future I'll have it like flash in the screen, but first pilot episode, we're not going to be doing any of that fancy stuff. Next up, Patriot. So Patriot, very strong archetype. It's definitely something that's always been around in the game. You play Patriot with Mystique and you buff cards up. It's just a consistent, fruitful archetype to play if you like that kind of thing. Just playing buffs into Ultron is just a strong mechanic that people can't really deal with very easily. You do have to be careful with stacking your buffs. So a very common problem is people just put all their cards in, all their buffs in one lane, and then it gets enchantress, especially by people playing like Sera control or something like that, it'll just get Enchantress and you lose all your buffs. So you definitely want to spread out your buffs so that it doesn't get completely demolished by a single Enchantress. So that's the one like key criticism there. And you also have to be careful of like Killmongers and whatnot. There's a lot of things to be aware of, but generally definitely a strong archetype to play. Next up, we have Thanos, Death, or Zoo. So this is another way of playing Thanos. They were definitely just good enough that I wanted to put in its own tier. This is not necessarily my preferred Thanos build. I definitely like the Lockjaw build or variant a little bit more. But if you don't have Lockjaw, which a lot of people will not, I definitely think you can run other Thanos builds, right? A lot of times you'll have a key card and then you won't have a secondary key card and you just think to yourself, oh, I can't play whatever. Well, that's not usually the case. Usually you can find a way to mitigate that downside. And I definitely think Thanos is such a flexible card. You are definitely able to play without the Lockjaw. So you can definitely just experiment, figure out what you like the best, and then go from there. So here we have a Death archetype. Here we have a Zoo archetype. They kind of play very similar to Deathwave, right? You have the wave and the death and your 1-drops or your stones. And then Zoo, you have your Kazoo, you have your Blue Marvel. You do have the Spectrum because a lot of your stones are also ongoing, so you can definitely take advantage of that. But they're just alternative archetypes that you can easily slot in Thanos for. And Thanos can go into a lot of archetypes, like a lot of archetypes. So anytime you really want to experiment, you can just add Thanos and see how it feels. This is definitely one of the ways to do it. Next up, we have DoomWave. So this is not Deathwave. This is DoomWave. So the difference here is that you're using Wave to go into Doom and She-Hulk instead of Death and something else. So it's a little bit more freeing because you're not restricted to the Destroyer archetype where you have to play a ton of these prerequisites. Here you can play whatever you want. And usually with the whatever you want, if you have no other reason to go a specific archetype, you usually go early control. So that's Iceman, Scorpion, Daredevil, whatever. You definitely want to control in the early game and then lock down the late game with the wave into Doctor Doom, She-Hulk, that kind of thing. So it's a nice, consistent, good deck, has a lot of power, has a lot of flexibility in how you want to play it out, and just works well. So definitely think this is something you can play if you want to pilot something like this. Next up, we have Sera Control. So this just revolves around counterplaying your opponents. You really just have a lot of tools that counter what your opponent wants to do. So Shang-Chi is in a lot of decks anyways. It's not really that unique. But you also have Enchantress. You also have Scarlet Witch. You also have Killmonger. All these cards really just want to mess with what your opponent wants to do and make them feel that pain. So there's definitely a good archetype. We have Hidden Monkey now, so Hidden Monkey can easily be added into the Sera Control archetype because it's very cheap and gives you a nice bomb on the final turn. So it just cleanly works out. Here we have one of the first spicy lists here to take a look at. This one is very reminiscent of Darius Master Mode Control Sera deck list, right? So he's using Master Mode to play Ronin. And because of that, DarkHawk also works very well with Master Mode. So it's a little bit of a Sera control list, but you're just controlling their hand a lot of their time instead of the board state. So it's definitely another take to Sera. I think Sera is a pretty standard list. It's easy to find other variations. Like if you don't want to play Hidden Monkey, you could put Armor in, right, as an easy alternative. If you don't have the Hidden Monkey, you can easily play Armor. There's not a lot of downsides to that. There's a lot of ways to just mix and match one card in that archetype. But I wanted to add another list. I think it's pretty good. If you have Master Mode, you want to take it for a spin, feel free to do that. Next up, we have Dracula. So Dracula is definitely an interesting card because it has such a unique mechanic in that at the end of the game, you'll get something and take its power. And there's a lot of ways you can really take advantage of that, having high cost cards in your hand, whether you're doing it through buffing hand or you're doing it through just having these huge stat values in your hand. So this archetype just focuses on abusing Dracula in as many ways as you can. So the first list is more of a flooding list where you flood the board so that the only cards in your hand are just big beat sticks, right? So you have Destroyer, which seems a little bit risky, but you are running armor, you are running Cosmo, so it's actually very easy. You're also running Zero, so it's very easy to mitigate that Destroyer effect. It's not actually that scary in this particular deck list. And then you have the Red Skull, obviously got nerfed, but it's still 12 points, still pretty strong. And then you have the Infinaut, of course, if you want to just slam down 20 points in a particular lane. So you just have a lot of heavy cards at the end, but you have a lot of cheap cards early so that you can guarantee hitting a heavy card. And then the next one, this is a Nina's noob list that we just took. It definitely takes advantage of Dracula and Ghost Rider to just discard a huge card and then summon it back on the field. With the Zabu, you have a ton of 4-cost cards. So the Zabu is going to get a ton of value here. And you're just trying to get this huge Lady Sin, Dracula, Ghost Rider synergy. And then just supporting that with your extra cast. So definitely another way of using Dracula. Feel free to take a look at this, see how it feels. Next up, we have Bounce. So Bounce is a nice archetype. It really focuses on Beast and usually Falcon. Nowadays, people are experimenting playing without Falcon, but usually Beast and Falcon to just bounce your cards back into your hand and then play them again for extreme buffs. So this is definitely a very strong archetype, and I actually think it could be higher tier. The one issue right now is that it's pretty weak to the meta. Sandman is being played pretty consistently, so you will be getting hit by that. And also a lot of your cards are, well, a lot of the DarkHawk in particular and the Hidden Monkey can be Shang-Chiable, so that could mess you up. And you are running like pretty one-dimensional composition, like if they know what they're doing. So, and even your bishop can be Shang-Chi'd. I see that a lot as well. So there are some weaknesses to the meta, but I definitely think if you're comfortable with this deck, this is an extremely strong deck. And if the meta settles a little bit away from Sandman and whatnot, and Leech as well, right? Like that destroys you. Like this can be a very, very powerful archetype. So you know, feel free to try it and see how it goes. Next up, we have Moon Girl Dino. So this classic strong archetype. I definitely am a fan of the Dino archetype. It always seems to stay in the meta and be relevant. Just the ability of Dino and then Mystique if you wanted. We don't have Mystique in these particular lists, but something you can do. Here it's a little bit more controlly where you have the Shang-Chi or you have the Doctor Doom alternative. But usually you're going Dino and then you're buffing up the Dino and you have these huge, strong archetypes and huge, strong cards. And then you usually run some type of counter to prevent them from dealing with it. So usually Cosmo's in there, Killmonger can be in there, Shang-Chi's almost always in there, Enchantress can be in there, Scarlet Witch can be in there. There's so many control cards that you can put on top of the Dino engine that it just works really well, and it usually reacts to the meta pretty efficiently. So if you need a Killmonger, you can just swap something added in. So it's a very flexible archetype that can just always be played in a meta, it seems. So definitely like this one. Think it's pretty good. If you've played the game, you've probably dabbled with Dino, so it shouldn't be too surprising to be like, oh yeah, I know how to play this, and you just go from there. Next up, we have got Discard. So Discard is definitely a unique archetype. It definitely plays a lot different than a lot of the other archetypes because you're milling from your hand, and it always feels like, ooh, you're giving your opponent information, and that's like the big downside of playing Discard. It's very easy to know they're playing Discard, but they do have huge tempo swings, right? When you get your setup down, your Morbius into your Modork, you can definitely just get like 20 power in a single turn. Same thing with Dracula. We've already talked about Dracula, how good it can be. It works very well in this deck. So when you have the synergies in, it's just a pretty powerful list to beat. So here we just have some classic discards. There's nothing too fancy. The second list has Lockjaw if you want to go for a little bit of a casino effect where you want to stack discard into discard into discard. Usually if you're doing that, you want to have the Apocalypse, because if you're hitting discard into discard into discard, you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of all those procs. So that's definitely another way you can do that. And the Colin Wing Swarm into the Lockjaw is definitely another way of taking advantage of that. So you just have to be aware of these synergies. But here we have classic discard. If you've been in the meta recently, you know how obnoxious it can be. There are some weaknesses with Leech and whatnot, but it's a fun deck. And if you have Modork, well, feel free to utilize it. Next up, we have classic Lockjaw. So this is what Lockjaw used to be before Thanos kind of took over the archetype completely, but it's still a very powerful deck. You run the Lockjaw into the Thor Jane Foster combo, and you have the Wasp to kind of just cycle all of your small cards and get them back and then cycle them again. So can be really big in terms of what the Lockjaw can give you, and as long as you're contesting another lane, this is a very, very powerful archetype. I do have a video on this particular archetype as well. I definitely want to talk about the videos maybe at the end. I think that makes more sense, where I'm like, here's the full list, here's the ones I have videos on. That you know, I'm workshopping as we go. What can you do? But overall, I think this is a pretty good archetype. Relies on Lockjaw is maybe its biggest downside, where if you don't hit the Lockjaw, there's the ceiling or the potential of the deck is definitely not as high. But if you do have a Lockjaw, that's when you feel confident, you can decide to snap into that. Next up, we have Galactus. So Galactus is very played in the meta right now. Definitely a fun deck. I do think that it does have some weaknesses in that you usually need to hit Galactus. It's usually your main and like only win con, so 25% of the games you're not going to see it unless you're running like an Item Warlock Yellow Jacket combo, which I haven't put in here. But a lot of times Galactus just has the weakness of, I don't hit Galactus, or my opponent's countered me, they put a Cosmo in my empty lane, or whatever, they've set it up where I can't Galactus. So the win percentage is not always super high with this deck, but when it does win, it feels strong, it feels punishing. If your Galactus can go off, it's very hard to beat it. So it's a strong deck, but it's slow because when you win, it's predictable and people won't really snap into that. And because it's predictable, when you get punished, it can also feel pretty demoralizing, where you think you're gonna play your Galactus, nope, there's the Cosmo, and you're like, oh man, like that kind of thing. But it's a very popular deck. It's always fun to scream, you know, as it goes up and destroys the other locations. So definitely cool. If you want to try it, feel free to. And it's played a lot. I'm sure you see a ton of this. Next up, we have Hid Monkey. So this is the newest card added to the game as of recording, of course. But yeah, definitely, I do think this is a card that's going to be in the meta moving forward. I think it's a strong card. I think it's something that has a lot of potential to be put in multiple decks. So I definitely think it is an archetype that will become relevant and continue to be relevant in the future. So the one issue right now with Hid Monkey is that people are experimenting with Hid Monkey. So people are just like, well, I'm going to ruin everyone who's playing Hid Monkey's days. So you're seeing a lot of Ramp, you're seeing a lot of Sandman, you're seeing a lot of Leech, you're seeing a lot of just people that don't like you. Yeah. So I do think that is going to be a bubble of like how many people are playing those particular archetypes, and as the meta settles, as people forget like you'll be able to play Hitmonkey a little bit more. So that's why it's a little bit down compared to some of the other archetypes. And there are archetypes with Sera control where I've put Hitmonkey in it. But if you're just fully reliant on Hitmonkey being your win condition, there might be some difficulties. But overall, if you are not fighting those matchups, this is a fantastic deck. This is really good. I do have my particular She-Hulk Hitmonkey variant as the third list. I thought it was really good. Looked really fun. Definitely have a video on YouTube if you want to take a look at me piloting that particular deck. If you're like, ooh, I need piloting tips and not like how to win tips, here you go. All right, moving on. We do have She-Hulk Infinaut. So this is the She-Hulk variant where you're passing and then playing Infinaut She-Hulk synergies, that kind of thing. The downside is you do need Magic and Psylocke for the pass into Infinaut final turn. So it's plays very much like a combo deck where you need specific pieces in specific windows, and if you don't draw them early, you don't have it, and it just can mess you up completely. So those are the issues, and because it can be predictable in what you're going to do each turn, people can take advantage of that. So that's another issue with this particular deck list. But it is strong. When it goes off hard, and it's really hard to contest if you can play the Infinaut or like double She-Hulk plus extra card. Like, it just gets crazy sometimes. So definitely a cool deck, a strong deck when it works, and something you can definitely try if you want to. Next up, we have Deathwave. So this used to be one of the strongest decks in the game, definitely before all of this Shuri nonsense. But Deathwave still is playable, still strong. It's just missing a little bit of the pieces. And right now, because of Shuri, armor is in the game like quite a bit, so it just loses to armor. So anytime you're fighting the Shuri matchup, the Shuri match is already hard, and then the armor will just lock you out of the game. So that's really its biggest struggle right now. Not that the archetype is bad, but just the matchup into Shuri is awful, and so many people are playing Shuri. So that's its biggest weakness. But if we ignore that, it's a pretty good deck. You've got the lockdown with the wave into She-Hulk plus death, usually, plus an extra card, usually Arrow or Magneto or something, or Shang-Chi if needed. So you have this huge swing on turn 6, and you have the setup just to get everything going. But of course, right now, it just has this big weakness into a very, very common matchup. But once that settles, once that passes, or if you still just like playing the deck, you can definitely try it out, see how it works for you. Next up, we have Silver Surfer. So, used to be a very strong deck with Zabu, but got nerfed a bit and really hasn't seen too much relevance afterwards. I do think with the Shadow King buff, there's definitely another opportunity to take advantage of Silver Surfer, moving Shadow King from a 4 cost to a 3 cost, even though it's not updated in that deck list, right? I am aware of the recent metagame updates, and I do think Shadow King can be an alternative like option into the matchup. There's a lot that Shadow King can take advantage of right now because of any locations that deal damage to you, right? You can restore that. Hitmonkey gets nerfed, Bishop gets nerfed, Shuri Red Skulls get nerfed. There's a lot of cards that you can really hit with this Shadow King. And I think with the cost reduction, that might be what it needed to become seen in the meta. So definitely cool. Silver Surfer really plays like a control deck because you have a lot of control tools with the Storm, with the Killmonger, with the Polaris, with the Juggernauts. You can do a lot of controlling things, and you really want to set up a strong turn 6, usually with Sera, just triple threes, or Nova or whatever you have, really, to just have this powerful finisher that people can't expect. Definitely a cool archetype that keeps seeing new discoveries as we keep playing. I don't even know if that's true, but it's a fun one regardless. Let's move on. We have Kazoo. Kazoo is usually how I say the name. But this is definitely one of the more powerful starter decks in the game. As you start in the game, there's not a lot of archetypes you can really play with that makes sense. And Kazoo is really the best one, in my opinion, as you're starting out to really just learn the game and really feel for it. But it's not an archetype that like dies off as you grow. It definitely becomes harder, and as Killmonger is like more common in the meta, it becomes more of an issue. But if that's not really the matchups you're seeing people playing Killmonger, you can definitely just run this back, see if you can flood turn 6. So the key here with Kazoo, after the early collection levels, is to learn when to flood. So if you're playing all your early game, all your 1-drops in the early game, and you get hit by Killmonger, that's it for you. You're done. So usually you want to wait until later in the game when you can play your cards later, and then hopefully, right? Like doesn't always happen, but hopefully they have priority. Their Killmonger goes out, and then you play your ones afterwards. Alternatively, you could just run bigger units in the late game. Here, the second list has Iron Man, has Onslaught as an alternative turn 6 play. And then other alternative is you can just play armor. So you just put your early game units under your armor so that it doesn't get hit by the Killmongers, and then you just play it as normal. So it's definitely an archetype that has different ways of piloting, and it's definitely a cool one. I definitely think it's one of the best archetypes to learn the game, and it can still be played later on. So don't ignore this like, oh yeah, I'm never going to play Kazoo again. You can definitely play it later on, and it always seems to be something that can still work in the meta. Now, next up, we have Strict Control. This is not Sera Control. This is definitely an archetype that is just based on using your control tools to win the game. So control usually is meaning lockdown. I would say things like Professor X, things like Daredevil can really just lock down what your opponent wants to do. So definitely want to say, if you're ever playing a deck with Daredevil, abuse Daredevil. Like, turn 5, your opponent does their turn, snap into that. Like, snap, like, it's so scary. It is very, very hard to not fall under the pressure of a snap on turn 5 when your opponent knows exactly what you're doing. So definitely take advantage of that. So main issue with this deck is you have to read your opponent. This is a thinking deck where, like, if you're not abusing Daredevil, it's a thinking deck where you have to kind of know what your opponent wants to do and make sure you're preventing them from doing what they want to do, whether it's Cosmo or Arrow or, Gamora or whatever it is, Shang-Chi. You definitely want to read their game plan and then counteract it. That's the name of the control. Second list just runs DarkHawk as an alternative, like, big bomb that you can play with, but not really necessary part of control archetypes generally. Next up, we've got Junk Viper, or Junk if you want to call it. So this one is just annoying players with cards, just giving them trash. Like, here you go. Do you want my hood? I don't want it. Here you go. Do you want my rock? I don't want it. Here you go. This is the deck where I was trying to put Sentry in, but I didn't have like a very like consistent I know Sentry will work list for you guys. So I'm definitely planning on doing more of these meta tier lists in the future. But obviously the day after a patch comes out, I'm not gonna know the meta. Like, that's not gonna happen. So I'm still figuring out where Sentry wants to be. I definitely think Sentry will be played, and this is a prime example of a deck that could easily play Sentry, but I just didn't have like that full confidence. Like, I want to place it in something that people will be watching for a while. So do have these more standard Viper lists. I do want to mention that Titania is such a key card in this archetype because you're able to lock an opponent from playing on that board, right? So if you can time it right, this definitely requires a lot of like guesswork and really predictive nature of where they're going to play. But if you can time a Titania right, you can completely lock them out of a lane and guarantee an easy win into that lane. It's such a hard thing to do, I would say, but so fulfilling if done correctly. It's just so good. So definitely a fun archetype, has a lot of strategies, and also has a lot of good matchups in the meta. Anything that likes to flood, this works really well into, right? Because you're just messing with their flooding game plan. So there's definitely a lot of reasons to play a deck like this. And if you're very comfortable with this deck, if you understand how this deck works, this can be definitely a powerful deck to play. So have fun with that. Next up, we have Wong reveal. So this is also a very starter-friendly deck. Wong early on is just an obnoxious card to deal with. You do have to be careful with Cosmo, and Arrow was also something you had to be careful about. There's definitely less arrows in the game, so it's not as problematic as it used to be, but Arrow was like such a problem with this. But with Arrow's removal, there's definitely more rationale to play a deck like this if you like playing with Wong, if you like having these big combos, these big numbers. Wong can definitely do that for you. So definitely a cool archetype. You still have to be careful about Cosmo. Cosmo is still very common in the game, so that's like the one downside here if you want to run this. But you do have the Storm. There's a lot of ways to really just avoid that scenario. Maybe not a lot of ways, but there are ways to avoid that scenario. And a lot of people play their Cosmo on 3 before you've played your Wong. So if that happens, you're good to go. So hopefully that's when you take advantage of your deck archetype and then snap and go for the win. So fun deck to play. Next up, we have Hela Casino. So Hela is not a bad deck. I actually think it's maybe a little bit better than the tier I've given it. But the issue is just the risk of Hela. You lose AQs with Hela. You also win AQs with Hela, but you lose AQs with Hela because there's not as much control of where the cards are being spawned. And that can really mess you up, right? Like imagine you play Hela, you get 3 cards back and you still lose because it spawns in the wrong location. Like that's happened to me multiple times. It doesn't feel good at all. So there's that issue, and then also you're playing discard, so you can discard the Hela. Obviously the deck tries to mitigate you discarding the Hela. It tries to help you with that, but it can definitely happen, and you do have to be careful about it. But I do like this deck. Like this I think is one of the funner decks to play personally, and I play it a lot. It can win for me. So yeah, I'm a thumbs up here. The second list is a little bit more beginner, not friendly, but there's more beginner cards in there. There's less. The first list has a ton of like pool 3 cards that you might not have, or the second list has a little bit more less pool 3 cards. You don't need the Doom either. I would say you need the Ghost Rider, but it's really just Hela being the main piece. You could run Magneto or whatever, so it's just a little bit more because this is something that people can run early and do well with, and you definitely want to not restrict these early deck lists with a ton of like unnecessary pool 3 cards. So that's what the second list is trying to do. But yeah, it has a bit of risk, but it's a fun deck, and the deck tries to mitigate that risk through some of the synergies that are built in. So next up, we have Destroy. So once again, this has the same issue with Deathwave in that armor kills you, and armor's very common. So that's really like the main issue with Destroy. I do think if Shuri gets nerfed and armor's not as seen as it is right now, you could definitely start experimenting with Destroy archetypes. We do have this first list, which is maybe a remnant of Dino. It's using Dino as its engine more than it's using Destroy as its engine. So it's more of a Dino list than a Destroy list. But I thought it fit here, so I decided to put it here. Second, third list are definitely more destroy centric. The first one is really just a hungry Deadpool deck where you definitely want to kill Deadpool over and over and over and over and over again. Get some synergy. There was some suggestions to use Bast instead of Sabretooth, and I definitely understand where that's coming from. It lets you like move out of the armored locations. Let's say you get armored early. Unfortunately, with a Bast, you can say, okay, I'll try again on a different lane. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. If you are trying this deck and you really want to make sure that the armor isn't a death nail, that's something you can do. Third list runs Null. Null is more of the finisher, the engine, more than this Taskmaster I have on the other one. So if you do have a Null, you definitely want to play with Null. This is something you can do. People always ask me, I have Null, but I don't have Galactus, but I want to play Null. I love the card. I love the hero or the villain or something. I'm not a lore expert. So this is a deck you can run, but be careful about armor. It will mess you up really badly. So that's the big downside there. But hopefully you're taking care of that. You're being attentive and finding windows for success. Next up, we have Move. So Move was the last one I put in because I wasn't sure I wanted to put Move in, but I was like, it's in the meta, I guess. The one thing I always have to talk about with Move players and Move decks is you have to be careful about Heimdall. It's a predictable card. People are always thinking Heimdall with Move decks. So you have to either be very sure that this Heimdall is amazing or psych him out. Don't play the Heimdall. Play something else. Anytime I lose to Move decks, it's not because of Heimdall. It's usually because they did something else that I was not expecting. Usually it's Doctor Strange. Let me tell you, they played Doctor Strange. They moved their Viper to another lane that I've invested in, and I'm like, they got me. Like that's what always happens. So do that. Like take advantage of that. I'm giving you some advice there. That's definitely where I get punished into Move decks. So you have to be careful about Heimdall, how predictable it is. And it's an early deck list that you can play pretty early into the game. There's not a lot that you need to pick up before you run this. So if you take advantage of that, that can be pretty strong. Second deck list runs a little bit more control tools with Shang-Chi and Enchantress to kind of surprise people on those final turns. They think you're going to do something. You'll hit them with a secondary game plan. Next up, we have Mr. Negative. So Mr. Negative is always a weird archetype, I guess, to discuss, in my opinion, because it loses a lot, essentially. But it doesn't mean that it's bad because it loses a lot. It just means that you're so reliant on Mr. Negative that if you don't draw it, like you've lost the game. So that's already 24% of the game you've just lost, right? Because you're drawing 75% of your deck a game. And it's higher than 25 because you have to draw Mr. Negative before turn 4. And usually you want it on turn 3 after you've ramped on turn 2. So like there's a lot of times you're not going to be getting that Mr. Negative hit. So does that mean the deck is bad? No, because when you do get that negative hit, you can really win. You can really dominate. These are the type of decks that win all 3 lanes all the time because when it pops off so hard, so strong. It's such a powerful deck list when it works. Now, it doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work most of the time. So you do like the strong negative decks have alternative win conditions, have a way to compete even if they don't draw negative at all. And that's really what you're seeing here. You have this first list with Bass being your secondary win condition with your Hit Monkey, with your bishops, all your synergies. You can give your cards a little bit of power and make them work well. Second one, you're running this Shuri Black Panther engine where instead of getting, well, it's more of a Black Panther engine. If you don't get your Mr. Negative, you can either go Shuri or you can go Wong into Black Panther, and then you can go Taskmaster or you can go Zola and really win that way. So that's another alternative win condition for the negative. And the third one, this one's more of like a classic Red Skull Shuri list, right? You've got Shuri, Red Skull, Taskmaster. And then if you get lucky, you can also just hit the negative and pop off that way. So these are all generally Mr. Negative decks, but the key is that they have secondary win conditions so that even if you don't draw negative, you can still compete. And those are the type of negative decks I'm okay with. Normally, I'm not a big fan of negative decks, but I think if you design their decks like this, then I'm okay saying this is a playable archetype. So feel free, experiment with these, mix and match how you like, but feel free to play with them. Now, next up, and I believe this is the last one of the list, we've got Cerebro 2, Cerebro 3. Now, they're together because they have the same downsides. I will say that I believe Cerebro 3 is better, but that could change like pretty easily depending on what gets added to the game. So like don't come in like a month later and be like, oh, like based on what gets added, these archetypes can really change dramatically. They're one of the most free-flowing archetypes. But currently, I do think if you have Basque, if you have Valkyrie, that gives you a lot of tools to work with. And you get to play Shang-Chi, right? That's really powerful. You get to play Killmonger. That can be really powerful. So there's a lot of good ways to run a Cerebro 3 deck, where Cerebro 2 is a little bit more one-dimensional. You kind of have to hope that your opponent doesn't have any tools to mess with you. So the issue right now is that locations screw you, cards screw you, decks screw you. Like there's a lot of things that just ruin Cerebro right now. And because Shuri is really popular, Red Skull just wins it for them. So those matchups are pretty doomed if the Red Skull player knows what they're doing. And then you can just lose off of your locations, and then you can also lose off not drawing Cerebro. So there's a lot of ways to lose. It's hard to have super consistency in a deck like this. Obviously, you can really mitigate it and have it feel like powerful, but the downsides are there, and you have to be aware of that when you're playing these decks. So I do want to put it in as an archetype that I'm saying is playable, but has a lot of weaknesses. So that's like the main issue with a Cerebro list. So as long as you're aware of that, I think that's perfectly fine, perfectly good. Thumbs up for me. So overall, those are all 20-something archetypes I put in for this particular tier list. Keep in mind, this is the first tier list, first meta tier list I've made. They're going to get better. Hopefully they'll get better from here, and I'll start experimenting and reading feedback and then going from there. Last thing I want to talk about is I do have a tier maker list of all the tier lists that we've made today. So here we go. This is the meta tier list, the tier maker list. So there's nothing on tier 0, as we talked about. Shuri was going to be there, but due to the nerfs very recently, decided that she's now the best of the tier 1s, which is still very, very strong. So it's not a big distinction, but it's something I wanted to do. Then we only have 4 on tier 1, right? So Thanos, DarkHawk, and then Electro. Those are just, I think, a little bit slightly better than the rest, but like that might be like percentage points, like few percentage points, like not that relevant. I think everything in here, I would say, can be played. Maybe like the tier 4s, you have to be a little bit careful. You have to know what you're doing, but everything else I definitely think can be played. Patriot, I think, is very strong, and these are ordered, so like I think Patriot is like one of the best. Thanos, DoomWave, Sera Control, Dracula, these can all be played. They're all very, very strong. Galactus, right, is where you start thinking like, ooh, there are legitimate downsides, I would say, once you hit into the tier 3. Not saying they're bad, but there are legitimate downsides with Galactus, Hitmonkey, She-Hulk, Deathwave, Surfer, Kazoo. Like there are you now have like these, there are problems in the decks that can be avoided if you play a different one, but it doesn't mean they're bad. You just have to be aware of these issues. And then the tier 4s have just these weaknesses that can be exploited if, you know, your opponents are aware of those weaknesses themselves. So that is the tier maker list. Definitely you can have a link to it themselves. And I don't know if I'll make this fancier in the future, but definitely wanted to have a list that people could look at and be like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. So overall, this was a long one. Probably going to have a break tomorrow. But this is something we can maybe start doing for the future. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you guys have a couple, 50 decks to try, right? Because that's how much is in there. It's more than 50. And take care of yourselves. Hope you have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be